Yeah.
Great. The title of the talk is the shoreline family tree. How are the organisms we see on the shoreline related to each other by evolution? Which organisms are more closely related to each other than some others? And set some limits on this. We're only going to look at organisms seen in the intertidal zone. We're not going to look at deep water or organisms on the land for obvious reasons, because we, as an organisation, concern ourselves almost entirely with the intertidal zone, from the splash zone down to the low water of the spring tides. And I'm only going to look at UK waters generally, but I will mention one or two exceptions to that where they're relevant to the family tree of organisms that we're going to be looking at. And I'm also not going to look at microorganisms either, only ones where the individuals are visible to the naked eye, the ones we come across on bioblitzes and things like that. And I'm also not going to look at individual species because it would take far too much time. I'm just going to look at the major groups of different things we find on the shoreline. I hope this is pretty much up to date, because this is an area which has changed a lot, certainly since I did my biology A level in school and things like that, and even more so in the last 15 to 20 years. There's been a lot of big advances and major revisions of this area in the last decade. And unfortunately, there's a lot of material on sites like Wikipedia and YouTube, etc., which is out of date to varying degrees. Some things are good, some things are very outdated, and with Wikipedia you find.
Well, can I interrupt you for a second, Rob?
Yeah, sure.
You're not. Do you mean to be sharing your screen now?
Yes. Can you see the?
Not shared. No, you've not shared it.
Oh dear. Sorry about that. Yeah. Yes, I didn't click the share screen. Sorry.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stick at it. All right. Right. So, like I was saying, hopefully it's up to date. There's lots of.
You haven't put yourself onto the. You know, we're just seeing. You haven't started showing this. That's it.
You need to go on the slide. Yeah. That's good.
Okay. Right. Okay. So yeah, I was saying that some things on Wikipedia are just sometimes individual pages are self-contradictory, and some things are just sort of plain wrong. I was watching a YouTube video a few weeks ago by an American university lecturer. I think it was actually one of his lectures for a course he put on YouTube, and he'd got red and brown seaweeds mixed up in what he was talking about in terms of this area of how things are related to each other, which was a bit embarrassing. But I think this is pretty much up to date, although there's still some things which are disputed, as we'll see very soon. Now, some of you may have come across or looked at these relationships and the sort of grouping of different types of organisms when you were at school, if you did biology classes or things like that. And certainly when I was doing my A levels in biology and even my first degree in the 1980s, things were more focused on divisions between different types of organisms than the relationships between them that sort of united them. So we looked at sort of plants compared to animals, and there's this idea of what's called a coelomate organism. That's an organism possessing a body cavity where the organs of the body are sort of inside it, versus an acoelomate organism, which is like a sort of like a solid mass of tissue. And also what's called diploblastic, having 2 layers of tissues, versus more advanced organisms like us with 3 layers. And of course, vertebrates versus invertebrates. And then the vertebrates divided into fish, amphibians, etc. Some of these ideas are still useful. Some have been sort of now considered not very relevant at all to how organisms are really related to each other. But of course, we still look at organisms in terms of phyla, which is one of the largest groupings of organisms, like annelids, for example, are one phylum. All the worms, from the ones you find in the intertidal zone to earthworms and leeches and things like that, they're all in the annelid phyla, and something like 25 different animal phyla have been identified by biologists. And then below that, you've got classes and so on down. Those ideas are still useful. And these are some of the animal phyla we come across on the shoreline: annelids, porifera, the sponges, chordata, which are basically the organisms with backbones, or the precursors of backbones. That's us, shorebirds, seals and otters, things like that. Bryozoa, echinoderms are a phylum, and also the mollusks. It's been known for a number of decades that some of these phyla are more closely related to certain other phyla than they are to some others which seem to be much more distant. The problem was some of these early ideas of which phyla were more were closely related were actually, we think now, wrong. For example, there's the articulata hypothesis, as it was known, which suggested that annelid worms were closely related to insects because both had bodies made up of a number of sections which were sort of hinged together. Now that's considered to be completely wrong now, as we see later. But since the 1970s, there's been a rapid growth of ideas on how the different groups are related to each other. So I think I mentioned phylogeny in the words that went with the poster for this talk. So what actually is phylogeny? Well, it's the relationship between all the organisms on Earth that have descended from a common ancestor. And this little diagram, which I pinched from somewhere or other, is an example of this sort of thing. You've got time here over some hundreds of millions of years. You've got firstly vertebrae evolved, our backbones, and organisms with vertebrae then split into sharks, which have got a skeleton of cartilage rather than solid bone. And then certain organisms evolved bony skeletons, and then some of those evolved limbs to give rise to amphibians first of all, and then from those evolved what we loosely call reptiles and birds, and the mammals on this side. And from that diagram, you can say that, well, dinosaurs stroke birds are more closely related to crocodiles, for example, than they are to primates. Excuse me. So, well, we think of the concept of fish, but actually fish are, in a sense, a sort of false grouping, because you could say that, well, the things up here, the mammals and the reptiles and the amphibians, are actually more closely related to ray-finned fishes then those ray-finned fishes are related to sharks, because all of these have got a bony skeleton and sharks do not have that. Excuse me. Okay, so we can draw a red box then around everything that's got a bony skeleton. They seem to be like a natural group of organisms. Everything that's got a bony skeleton is, you could say, one group of organisms. And the first organism with a bony skeleton would be back in the distant past, down here somewhere. And we give this group a name, which is the osteichthyes, which literally means the bony skeleton organisms. And we call that group, we can call that group a clade, not a phylum, like we say for fish, sorry, for vertebrates or for annelids, but actually call it a clade because it's evolved from one common ancestor back here that first developed a bony type of skeleton. Okay, so how do we work out where to put things in this sort of diagram? How did people devise that diagram or tree in that sort of shape rather than some other one? Well, firstly, it was done in probably the 18th or 19th century by looking at the detailed structure of living organisms. And one of the classic examples of that is what's called the pentadactyl limb, where you've got the same type of limb in frogs, in lizards, in birds, and indeed ourselves. And it's common to all what are called tetrapods, all organisms that have got four limbs. They've got a similar type of structure, but the proportions have greatly changed. If you look at a bird, for example, they've got these very long carpal bones, which are the bones of our wrist, which form the end part of the bone in the wing. But we can deduce that they all evolved from a common ancestor, and they're not at all like the leg of a beetle, for example, or the leg of a crab or something like that. And biologists during the 20th century and into this century went on to deduce things like that for all sorts of groups of organisms by looking in detail at various parts of them. And of course, you can soon do the same for fossils, although only usually you've got the bones or the shells to look at. So most extinct forms of organisms have now been placed somewhere in this tree of life with reasonable certainty, although there still are a couple of areas which are sort of disputed. And of course, in the last 20 years, as Mike mentioned, we've got molecular evidence from DNA sequencing has also been used. And that's made huge advances in the understanding of where the different organisms fit in. Basically, the idea is that DNA sequences in organisms change slowly over time. And if they change enough, you get a divergence into a different species and eventually into maybe a different type of organism altogether. So different species with small differences in DNA, very small differences, are probably closely related to each other, whereas ones with big differences in their DNA sequence are probably going to be more distantly related and have separated from each other a very long time ago. And basically, this is the idea that's been used to refine these relationships and this sort of tree of life over the last 20 years or so. Now, the thing with these phylogenetic trees, as they call these sort of family trees of groups of organisms, is that, well, potentially you can give a name to every sort of twig, if you like, or major branch of this tree of life. And indeed, there'll be an example on the next slide on how this has been done almost to an excessive degree. So if we look at this diagram, which looks perhaps a bit confusing with all these colored boxes. So I mentioned you can define and name a group of organisms, a clade, as the specialists in this area call it, which forms any cluster of branches on the tree. So the biggest one, which encompasses everything on this tree, which is the purple edged box, is what's called the gnathostomata, the jawed fish. So the first organism right down here, that vertebrae, or certainly encompasses everything on that tree, all of them evolved from a jawed fish. The very first fish that evolved did not have jaws. They were sort of like lampreys and hagfish, which are have got a mouth, but they don't have jaws as such. Then if you look at the box, which is just pink, where that everything there evolved from a fish with a bony skeleton, that's the osteichthyes we mentioned earlier, the bony fish. Then if you look at the box with the blue edging, which includes amphibians and things above that, they all evolved from the what are called the sarcopterygiae, which basically is lobed finned fish, fins which had lobes at the base of their fins, which eventually evolved into the limbs that we have and reptiles have and amphibians have. They evolved into arms and legs from these little lobed fins. And then the box with the green edging, number 4 there, which includes mammals and reptiles and birds, is what's called amniota, because they evolved amniotic eggs. That is, eggs that don't need to be in water all the time, like frog spawn, for example. Their eggs can hatch out on land, and of course some of them, like the mammals, have done away with the eggs altogether. The new individual develops inside the organism. And then finally, the yellow edged box is the mammals, and well, it's got hair there, but that's so not a sort of very good defining feature of the mammals. There's lots of other things that separate us from the reptiles and the birds, etc. I mentioned that this idea of phylogeny can generate a plethora of names for clades at all levels. And if you just nip back to the previous slide a moment, you can see what's happening as we go from the entire group here, the gnathostomes in the purple edged box, working our way up to the mammals, is that we're sort of losing a branch at a time, then giving a name to what is left after that branch has been cut off.
Rob, we've had a question from John Hepburn, who's his system isn't working properly, but anyway, he's asked a question, which is, did the lobe-finned fishes die out?
That's a good question. No, I think there's still a few around, although they are very limited now to specialized environments. I think there's a few which are still alive in Australia and parts of the world like that. And they're also closely related to the coelacanth, which of course, a very celebrated fish, because it was thought to be extinct. And oh dear, my voice is in real bad shape today. It's thought to be extinct, but actually was rediscovered in the 1930s. So I think they do still exist, actually, but there's just a few dozen species left or something like that. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned this idea that we generate all these different names as you sort of chop off a branch or ignore a branch as you're working away towards a particular small group of organisms or even an individual species. And this is one example of this, going up to the level of birds. So we'll mention what some of these are later, but basically you can say, well, archaea is a clade that includes all the organisms that we know of on the earth. We also evolved from these bacteria-like things, which are now given the name of archaea. And then they gradually evolved to produce. There's some background noise coming through from somebody's voice somewhere. Oh, is that my feedback? I'm getting feedback on my my headphones.
No, it's Mike. Mike's not muted, I think.
Oh, right. I thought it was my own. Okay, yeah, so
I'm muted. I'm unmuted.
right, okay. Yeah, so then if you get rid of all the things which are sort of bacteria-like organisms, you eventually get to eukaryotes, which are still single-celled, but rather more complex organisms. And then you can go on, and people have named all of these groups as you get rid of various microorganisms, which are, if you like, not on the branch that leads to animals and eventually to birds. And eventually you get to this group, which again we'll mention later. That includes all the animals plus the fungi. And so you can basically devise names, some of which, the ones in bold, are fairly commonly used by biologists. Others are just like some of these, which are just a preserve of people who specialize in phylogeny, really, and are never used in ordinary sort of ordinary science. But eventually, after 39 steps, you can get to a branch of the tree which just contains the birds. But all of these have been given names, and there's probably thousands of different names of groups that have been done in this sort of way. Instead of working your way towards birds, for example, you could work your way towards, I don't know, annelid worms or something like that, or to mollusks and so on, and generate another load of names along the way. Okay, so how far back in time do we need to look to find the origin of everything we find in the intertidal zone? Well, the answer is almost to the beginning. And the reason for that is due to lichens, basically. The lichens you find in the upper parts of the intertidal zone and just above where the waves splash the higher rocks, the shoreline, They are actually made up, as you probably know, of two separate types of organisms. You've got the fungal component, and you've also got a component which does photosynthesis, which is the commonly called blue-green algae, properly known as cyanobacteria. And actually the bacteria separated from the organisms which gave rise to all the animals and plants and all the other things you find on the shoreline back something like 3,200 million years ago. Now, the difference between bacteria and these things, archaea, which you may not have heard of, was only sort of realized, I think, in the 1970s or maybe in the 1980s, because they look pretty much the same. The only difference between them is sort of fundamental things in their biochemistry and cell membranes, but these differences are thought to be so fundamental that they must have separated very early on in the history of life. So the bacteria went their own way, and something like 3,200 million years ago, but the archaea, very similar looking things, eventually, probably by actually incorporating bacterial cells into themselves, they went on to give rise to the eukaryotes, which are the complicated cells that make up all the plants and animals on the shoreline, and also most of the single-celled organisms other than bacteria that you come across if you've done school biology and things like that. Okay, in the diagrams that I'm going to show of these family trees, I put some dates in when it's thought that two different groups diverged from each other. Now, how do we know when this was? Well, the obvious thing is to look in the fossil record for new types of organisms arising. But for some of them, we've got very patchy sort of fossil records. And actually, in the last particularly 10 to 15 years, scientists have tried to use another method, which is called molecular clocks. This is based on this rate of DNA change that we talked about. So the idea is you look at two living species, for example. You might look at, say, an annelid worm and a mollusk, and look at how much difference there is in the DNA between them, and try to work out from that amount of difference how long ago they actually diverged from each other, how long ago that the mollusks diverged from the annelid worms. The problem with this is the first, well, particularly in the early days of it being done, some of the divergence dates were extremely early in the history of life, a very long time ago. And there's no fossil evidence of the new groups arising until much later. And this is still a source of controversy. It's called the rocks versus clocks. With the rocks, you've got solid evidence of new organisms arising, whereas the clock thing is sort of abstract and based on inferring ages from this difference in the DNA. And this is still a bit of a problem. And generally what I've done is pick a sort of middle path. And the example there is echinoderms. The molecular evidence from the molecular clocks says they first arose 600 million years ago, or even more than that. The first certain fossil we've got of them is about 500 55 million years ago. So I've used a date of 570 because it may be that the first ones did arise a little while before we see the first fossils of them. So what was the first multicellular organism? That's the ones we're concerned about, because they are generally visible to the naked eye, whereas most single-celled things are not. And actually, they're probably seaweeds, in fact, a red seaweed. So how did they arise? Well, the first split in the eukaryotes, the organisms with complicated cells, if you like, was between one group which gave rise to the seaweeds and the land plants, and the other group which eventually gave rise to the animals and fungi. But the first one of these we know of at all is this little thing here, Bangiomorpha, which we got fossils of from 1,050 million years ago. That's almost twice as old as the first multicellular animals that we got definite evidence for. But this thing actually is minute. As you can see, that's a scale bar there of 25 micrometers. So the all of that picture A there is only about, what, 1/4 of a millimeter from top to bottom. So that's just a tiny thread. You'd have to use probably a hand lens to actually see it. But you can see the separate cells in it, and these are the reproductive structures. It's amazing that that has survived as a fossil from over 1 billion years ago. But anyway, you can see there there's a split into 3 later groups of organisms we're interested in. What's called the chromister, which eventually gave rise to brown seaweeds and things like that. And then what's called the archaeplastida, the ancient organisms with plastids, which like basically are chloroplasts. And you've got the land plants, the green and the red seaweeds in those, and the other group gave rise to animals and fungi. But all of these, until well after this split into 3 groups, all of them were still unicellular organisms. So you shouldn't think that, for example, the brown seaweeds evolved from early sort of red or green seaweeds. At the point where they split apart back 16 or 1800 million years ago, all of them were single-celled organisms. They were nothing like the seaweeds we see on the shoreline now. And
so, Rob,
yeah, sure.
I'll ask you a question. When you say brown seaweeds, you mean kelp, obviously, but do you mean the fucus seaweeds as well? Are they all?
Yeah, fucus and kelp. Yeah, and all the small thread-like ones as well.
Yeah.
All the brown seaweeds evolved from single-celled organisms in this group called the chromister. Yeah, in fact, the brown seaweeds are very interesting in this regard, because it's been suggested that the big seaweeds we see on the shoreline, the brown seaweeds, only evolved maybe about 200 million years ago, which means that they are only about the same age as mammals, for example, in terms of their origins. So up till that time, all the things in this group, the chromister, were single-celled, and indeed most of them still actually are tiny single-celled organisms. Whereas the first red seaweeds, as we can see here, were, well, sort of visible and multicellular over 1,000 million years ago. And again, the red and brown seaweeds are very interesting because they look very similar on the shoreline. That's a red seaweed at the top, brown one at the bottom, but they're actually, they diverged an awful long time ago, maybe about 1800 million years. They both evolved multicellularity into multicellular organisms separately from each other, and have ended up, some of them, looking very similar through adapting to the same sort of environment. And also, every single cell in a brown seaweed has got a fundamental difference to a cell in a red or green seaweed or a land plant. Now, what is this actual difference? Well, it's to do with the things called plastids. If you remember back to school biology, all green plants and all seaweeds, indeed, have got things in them called chloroplasts, which are the things that carry out photosynthesis, enable them to turn sunlight into energy for themselves so that they can manufacture food. It's thought that these chloroplasts and similar things to chloroplasts are all actually engulfed cyanobacteria, the same sort of bacteria that are in lichens. And for some reason, back over 1,000 million years ago, for some reason, a cell swallowed a cyanobacteria, which it would normally sort of eat and digest. But instead of digesting it, it actually incorporated it into its body and began to use it for photosynthesis, and gave it a home instead of just eating the thing straight away, if you like, and use its ability to capture sunlight and make food from that, and use that for its own purposes. So instead of being digested, it became what's called symbiotic. But it's thought this sort of thing happened in two different ways. In red and green seaweeds on the one hand, and brown seaweeds on the other. So at the top, you've got what's thought to have happened to form the cells of the first group, the red seaweeds, the green seaweeds, and the land plants, where you've got a simple, very simple single cell. It swallows a cyanobacterium, which is itself photosynthetic, and it incorporates that into itself, and instead of digesting it, actually makes use of it. And then when the cell divides into two, the chloroplast, as it's become now, the cyanobacterium divides as well. And so then you get that preserved for future generations. Now, what seems to happen with the brown seaweeds and their relatives is that, again, you've got a simple sort of cell here. Instead of swallowing one of these, a simple cyanobacterium that carries out photosynthesis, it's actually swallowing one of these, a whole cell that's got a nucleus and the cyanobacterium within it. It swallows that and incorporates that. So you can see that the difference here, it's like a cell, if you like, within a cell, a complex cell within the new, even more complex cell. And all the cells of brown seaweeds are like that. And they've still got bits of the original complex cell within the membrane that surrounds the photosynthetic plastid. So all the cells in a brown seaweed are sort of fundamentally different to the cells you get in red and green seaweeds and the land plants. So this indicates that this sort of idea of using a cyanobacterium for photosynthesis by capturing it and using its energy, has happened at least twice, but happened in different sorts of ways in the two different groups. Okay, so we're going to look now at these Archaeplastida, and they divided to give us the red seaweeds first. And again, that happened an awful long time ago, maybe about 1500 million years ago. And that's all the red seaweeds we find on the seashore, the ones that look like brown seaweeds, or the sort of very leaf-like ones that are like porphyra and things like that, and dulse and so on. And then that left us with what's called the viridiplantae, the green plants. As you can see, the green seaweeds are, if you like, the cousins or the sisters of the land plants, which I've represented there by thrift, although I could have used seagrass as well, which actually maybe is sort of borderline for our remit of the intertidal zone. But again, these separated from each other something like 650 million years ago. There's another group here, which are what are called the stoneworts, which has anyone come across these in ponds and places like that? They're not very common, but they're very like a very primitive sort of green plant, but they don't actually fall within the land plants. Somebody trying to?
Yeah, sorry, Rob, it's me. Yeah, I'm kind of familiar with the freshwater ones, but how does, and there are coastal ones as well, aren't there, species?
Of stoneworts? I don't know. I've only come across them in ponds and lakes and places
sorry.
like that.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think I got mixed up with something. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you only find them where the water is very low in nutrients, and they don't get sort of overwhelmed by ordinary types of pondweed and water lilies and things of that sort. But they're actually more closely related to the land plants. And then the next branch back leads you to the green seaweeds. But of course, seaweeds don't have proper roots or flowers or anything like that in the way that that land plants do. Okay, now the other branch from a couple of slides back leads to animals and fungi. And I can remember some like 30 years ago, a friend of mine I used to go hill walking with, he was a vegan, which was at that time quite unusual. And another person in the club who was an agricultural, a lecturer in agricultural college, he liked to rib this friend of mine about being vegan. And he said, I think he said to him one day, "Oh, you do know that fungi are animals, don't you? You shouldn't be eating mushrooms and things like that." So because I was a scientist even back then to some extent, he asked me whether this was the case or not. And I explained to him that, well, fungi are not animals, but they are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants, which is perhaps surprising. And that seemed to satisfy him such that he could carry on eating mushrooms, even though he wouldn't eat dairy products or meat or things like that. So yeah, the group, this obscurely named group Opimoda that we saw in one of the previous diagrams, this gave rise to amoeba on one branch, again a huge amount of time ago. And again, amoeba is one of these things that's commonly studied in schools as a very sort of animal-like single-celled organism. The other branch gave rise to what are called opisthocons, and both animals and fungi are opisthokonts. And that group, again, goes back a long way, well over 1,000 million years ago. But again, this split between the animals and the fungi occurred when everything was unicellular. They were just different types of unicellular organisms, some of which evolved, this branch evolved into fungi. The only ones we're interested in are the fungi that form lichens. And the other branch eventually gave rise to multicellular animals. But even now, a lot of fungi themselves are still unicellular. Yeast, for example, that are used for brewing beer and so on. They are a type of fungi, but they are single-celled organisms. And there's lots of unicellular relatives of the animals, which are more closely related to the animals than they are to the fungi. So how did animals come about? We're used to animals being multicellular things, usually large. Nearly all of them are visible to the naked eye, whereas unicellular organisms, nearly always you need a microscope to see them. Well, there's various theories. The most popular one, and the one that's been held for many decades, is that these little things, which are called choanoflagellates, little single-celled things here, they look very like the individual cells you get in a sponge. Sponges basically are made up of millions of cells, which are very similar to these choanoflagellates. In fact, the cells of sponges are called choanocytes, a very similar name to these single-celled organisms. And the theory is that these choanoflagellates sort of aggregated together in colonies and settled down on the seabed, and they essentially became sponges through a very simple type of evolution, if you like that, just by getting together and not bothering much with things like many different types of cells or forming organs and tissues and that type of thing. They're just like a bag of these cells all joined together side to side virtually. So this would mean, if that was the case, that the ancestor of all the other animals branched off from the ancestor of sponges. So you've got some sort of minute organism here of maybe a few cells. One branch of them became sponges, and the other branch became all the other animal types that we see on the land, the sea, and the intertidal zone. Now, that doesn't mean that there was, a sponge like you see, like a breadcrumb sponge on a rock on the seashore, for example, and somehow something like that evolved into a mollusk or a worm or something like that. It doesn't mean exactly that sort of thing. It just means that they've got a common ancestor, and the first branch off that common ancestor, if you like, was things that look vaguely, or would have looked vaguely like present day sponges. However, there's another idea that the first animals were things called ctenophores. Now, we don't see those in the intertidal zone of Britain, so I'm making an exception here to mention them. They're these things at the top right. They look vaguely like jellyfish, but are actually quite distinct from them. And this is based on the molecular or DNA evidence, and some ways of interpreting these DNA analyses is that the ctenophores were actually the first animals, and that all the other animals, including the sponges, evolved from the ancestors of those. At the moment, it's still disputed, but it's sort of swinging back to the sponges at the moment. But whichever way it was, the first sort of animal fossil we've got that's sort of undisputed that we're interested in is in fact a sponge. And this is 1 year, this tiny thing from 600 million years ago, and probably the sponges originated even earlier. But anyway, from the ancestors of sponges came two separate groups, the bilaterans, which are the organisms which are bilaterally symmetrical, and then the other group is the what's called the cnidarians, which are basically the things like corals, jellyfish, sea anemones, all these things which are either sort of what's called radially symmetrical, sort of a round profile, or branching things like corals. The bilaterans we're looking at now, they split up into two groups, and these groups have only been recognized again as sort of major groupings of animals in the last 20 to 30 years or so at the most. One's called the protostomes, which is almost all kinds of worms, the arthropods, which are the crustaceans and insects, the mollusks, the bryozoans, and a few other things. And then the other group is, in terms of different types of things, if you like, quite a small one really. It's the vertebrates and the echinoderms, so are the sort of closest cousins of the animals with backbones. So how many deuterostomes are in the picture on the right out of the 11 things you can see? Can anyone tell me how many of the deuterostomes we've got out of those 11? Anyone want to make an offer? Right, well, let's count them up then. It's vertebrates and echinoderms. So we got the frog, which is a vertebrate. It's got a backbone. We've got an owl, that's 2. This thing, which is a fossil trilobite, that's not a vertebrate. Spider is not, that's in the group here. Oh, we've got a monkey, that's 3. A turtle, 4. A fish, 5. And we've got a shark, 6. So we've actually got 6 deuterostomes. It's a trick question in a way, because I didn't put any echinoderms in the picture. They're all actually 6 vertebrates. The other 5 are in the group called protostomes, which are the worm-like things. This is a flatworm. We've got arthropods, which includes insects and spiders. And it also includes mollusks, like our snail here. And this thing is, you may have heard of trilobites. They're extinct things which are very much like crustaceans, really. So they would be in the arthropods as well. Okay, so deuterostomes, these are some shoreline deuterostomes. It's got, you know, human beings. We've got fish. We've got sea otters and seals, if you want to include those, plus birds. We've also got the sea squirts in there as well, because they are actually chordates, even though they haven't got a backbone as such. But we'll look at that in the next slide or two. Why are these very sort of simple and certainly not looking like things with the backbone? Why are they close to things which have got a backbone, like fish and indeed ourselves? Well, the reason for that we'll be coming to in one or two slides. This is the huge family tree I've done of the deuterostomes, and you can see that I won't talk you through all of this. Obviously, this is the you've got things with the backbones or the predecessors of backbones, the chordates, on the one side, and they split off about 600 million years ago, and they gave rise to the sea squirts and the various fish, and then the tetrapods, which includes ourselves. In the other branch, again, this word, which is very rarely used, what's called the ambulacrarians, which are basically the echinoderms of different sorts, starfish, brittle stars, sea urchins, etc. It's also got this obscure group called the acorn worms, which look a bit like ribbon worms, but we don't find them, or very rarely find them, in the intertidal zone of Britain. I put in a couple of fossil things here. This is the first thing which looks sort of vaguely like a fish that we can find as a fossil. This thing with this name that I'm not going to even try to pronounce, that's about 518 million years ago. So it's going to be back here somewhere. And then this very bizarre looking thing is thought to be a fossil ambulacrarian. Whether it's a proper echinoderm or not is not very clear. But again, this is extremely old, 520 million years ago. So why are sea squirts thought to be closely related to vertebrates, things like fish and other backbone animals? Well, the clue is a thing called a notochord, which is basically like a precursor of our own vertebral column, our own backbone. It's not actually bony, but it's like a rod of sort of semi-rigid tissue, and sea squirts, when they are larvae, have actually got this thing, and the larva of a sea squirt does look a bit like maybe a tadpole, for example. It's got this thing like a body and a short tail and something vaguely like a head with a mouth and an anus. But what it does is, or what most sea squirts do when they become adult, is they change completely. The most of the body and the tail, and indeed the notochord, shrink hugely. They settle down onto a rock, and this area here, the sort of mouth cavity, expands hugely. So they turn into like basically a big mouth with a very or mouth cavity, a big throat with a very short gut leading to the siphon. And so although they look completely different to fish as an adult, when they are larvae, they do look a little bit fish-like. And there's a clue to that from these fossil things, which are long extinct, these things called vetulicolians. They looked very much like sort of larval sea squirt, but they kept that sort of form into adult life with a very simple mouth, not much in the way of sensory organs, a tail, and they've possibly got a notochord, although it's doesn't tend to be preserved in their fossils, unfortunately. So this is what the family tree of the deuterostomes, of which we are a member, looks like. And we get into more recent times now. This is one of the lobed-finned fish that was mentioned. You can see they got fins, which are not just sort of transparent rays, but they are actually like little stubby arms and legs. And that's indeed what they did evolve into. Fish literally came out of the water, started using those little stubby limbs to walk around, and they developed into, over millions of years, arms and legs. There's two branches of interest to us. One evolved into reptiles, and we don't have to worry about crocodiles in our own coastal zone, but they in turn evolved into a group called Aviometatarsalia, which basically means bird metatarsals. And metatarsals are the bones in your hand that go from your wrist to the base of your fingers. And birds have a particular sort of structure of those, particularly in their feet, which evolved even before the time of the dinosaurs. And birds essentially did evolve from dinosaurs themselves. The other branch leads to the mammals, basically the eutheria, the sort of modern mammals, which includes otters, ourselves, seals, etc., in the coastal area. Yeah, just look at this very quickly. You've got the dinosaurs here, and basically one little group of dinosaurs evolved into birds, and essentially over the last 20 years or so, lots of fossils have been found of dinosaurs which looked like birds, but they were actually not, if you like, real birds at all. They were simply dinosaurs with feathers, small dinosaurs that looked like birds, but never actually evolved into birds proper. They were simply dinosaurs that evolved feathers for purposes that maybe were not very clear. Some of them maybe were gliding things, others were maybe some courtship plumage, or to enable them to run faster by flapping feathery arms or something like that. But these are actually feathered dinosaurs, not actually birds. Just a slide I put in for amusement, really, because our ideas again about that have changed a lot in the last 20 years or so. Okay, and seeing my time is getting on a bit now, so I'll try to go through the others fairly quickly. Protostomes, the other group, most of the things we see on the shoreline are actually protostomes. This group includes mollusks and crustaceans and worms and various other things. Has anyone come across nematines, which are ribbon worms under rocks in the low tide area? Has anyone found them on bioblitzes or their own poking around in the lower shore? I've come across them on one or two beaches in South Wales, coiled up underneath rocks when there's a very low spring tide. They're very sort of fragile things, but they're actually thought to be closely related to flatworms, which we came across a few of when we were down at Mount Batten a couple of weeks ago. And they are both in a group called the Parenchyma, and they're thought to be sort of sister organisms or sister groups to each other. Now, again, that's a very different idea to what there was when I was at school. And they are both thought to be very closely related to annelid worms like ragworms and the polychaete worms you find in the on the shoreline. When I was at school, flatworms were thought to be very distantly related, very primitive things that were, a long way away from sort of more advanced types of invertebrates like annelids and so on. But the thinking is now that they're actually quite close to them.
Rob,
yeah,
there's got another question here from John Hepburn, who's asking, do the nematines include bootlace worms?
Bootlace worms. What would they be? What group would they be? Does he mean horsehair worms?
Well, I'm really. If you watch the chat, I
Butless
think
worms.
John will put up on the
Oh,
chat what he means,
right.
because he's not able to. He's muted. He's
Yeah, I can see the chat. I've just brought it up in the middle of my screen here. So, because horsehair worms are things that he come across.
here. We are. He's looking for the scientific name right now.
Oh, right, yeah. So perhaps he can come back to me later.
If you look at the chat again.
Oh, right, okay. Horsehair worms are quite interesting because they are not in this group at all, actually. Or, well, they're not in the, this group is called Spiralia, which is all the bryozoans, mollusks, annelid worms, and all the flatworms, etc. Bootless worms. It depends if bootless worms are actually annelids or by the way, the thing that links all of these things together in the things I've shown in the pictures here is the fact that they've all got this type of larva, this what's called a trochophore larva, and all these organisms, the annelids and the mollusks, have got this same type of larva, and that's how we know. We think we know now all these are linked. Linnaeus. I might have to come back to that at the end, actually, because I'm not sure. If you go into Wiki, anemotians. Ah, that's right.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that.
Yes, yes. So they would be nemotians. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You tend to find these things underneath rocks at low tide. They're very fragile things. I managed to collect a specimen once when I was still a lecturer in South Wales. They're very easy to sort of break up if you try to pick them up. Yeah. So anyway, so.
Rob, we got 12 minutes left.
Yeah, okay, so I'll move on. My screen doesn't seem to want to move on to the next slide. Oh dear. What's happening? Oh dear. I'm trying to get my screen to move to the next slide. It doesn't seem to want to do it. Oh. Yeah, oh, there we are. It's done it at last. Okay, so yeah, again, I'm not sure which of these worms we've come across on BioBlitz. I think it's one of these two, either Echiurian worms, these sort of obscure things, or the Sipunculans. I think it was a Sipunculan worm. Both these now, anyway, they used to be, if you look in books about the seashore, they very often put these two groups, the Sipuncula and the Echiuria, in sort of divisions or phyla of their own, separate to all the annelid worms. But they're now thought to be actually within the annelids. They're thought to be highly sort of, well, differentiated or derived sort of annelid worms, but they all are actually within the annelids, like the leeches and earthworms and the polychaetes you find on the crawling around on rocks in the intertidal zone. Yeah, the sedentary worms, the ones that sort of people that remain attached to rocks, used to be thought to be like a distinct group of their own, but they're actually now thought to be in two separate parts. One lot are thought to be closely related to the leeches and earthworms we're familiar with in the on the land, and the other lot of them are thought to be closely related to these strange Echiurian worms. And then the other group, completely separately, is the Errantia, things like the polychaetes that wander around on the rocks. Okay, the other big group is the mollusks, and these have diversified into the bivalves on the one hand, again going back 530 million years ago, and then you've got the cephalopods, which are all the squid, octopus, cuttlefish, things like that. Only very rarely turn up in rock pools and so on. And it's quite interesting. The very first mollusk we got a fossil of, this thing called Kimberella, looks very much like a chiton. So it may be that the first mollusks were very much like chitons, and that the other types of them, the cephalopods and the bivalves and all the snails and sea slugs and things, evolved from this type of mollusk. Now, the other group is an interesting one. So you've only got a couple of minutes left. What's called the ecdysozoa, and this relates to the fact that they sort of shed their skeleton, like the way crabs shed their exoskeletons. So you can find some discarded crab shells that the new crabs have sort of grown out of and discarded. And it basically means that all of the organisms in this group are linked by their ability to do this sort of thing. And surprisingly, it includes things like roundworms, which are tiny things that live in the soil, and some of them are parasites of animals, but they're actually closely related to all the arthropods, all the things we find on the shoreline that have got jointed limbs. Well, I'll cut out a couple of these slides. We've got the first branch is the sea spiders, and they are distantly related to all the other organisms in this group. All the crustaceans, or the few insects we find in the intertidal zone, all the crabs, lobsters and things like that. But back in the Cambrian period, back around 500 million years ago, there was a huge diversity of these crustacean-like things that sort of exploded at this time. It's been called the Cambrian explosion. All kinds of bizarre organisms and different types of things we now believe are related to crustaceans originated at this time. And there's very little trace of them any earlier. And so the crustaceans are a hugely diverse group, and actually only a small proportion of the different branches are actually found in the intertidal zone. A lot of them are found in deep water, and some of them, like the insects, are mainly found on land, and others, like are found only in fresh water. Okay, so this group is called pancrustacea. It's all the crustacean-like things. It actually includes the insects, because insects, it seems, evolved from early crustacean-like things, maybe things that look vaguely like the water fleas that you find in freshwater ponds. We only find a few insects in the intertidal zone, things like the little springtails, Columbola, and the bristletails here. All the other groups are what are called the malacostracans. All these things that are vaguely, or most of them, look like different types of shrimps and prawns, basically. Lots of different groups of shrimp-like things, but also the amphipods and the isopods, which are probably quite closely related to each other. And the final group we're going to look at is this one with the, again, the obscure name Pliocyamata, and this includes many familiar things that we see on the intertidal zone, the true shrimps and the lobsters and the Scott lobsters and hermit crabs and the true crabs, and they all in one group, which are probably separated from each other, maybe something like 450 million years ago. So you can see that all these groups in the crustaceans evolved an awful long time ago, but all apparently diverged fairly rapidly within the space of 50 to 100 million years. Okay, so you've got time, maybe 5-6 minutes for any more questions. Let's go very fast.
Yeah, I'll be fairly quick, but just to say, Rob, thank you. That was a great talk. So much detail. I mean, we were doing a kind of trip into the murky world of taxonomy, which by its very nature is complex and, as you know, constantly changing, just to confuse us all. I'd just like to say a thank you, actually, because I was unfamiliar with the acronym Maya. So that's a great term. Thank you for that. And my stupid intervention, I was thinking of stone crops, plants, as opposed to stone walls. I do know what stone walls are. So, yeah, sorry, I got a little bit confused. So anybody got any very quick questions for Rob right now? Anything at all?
Well, I've got one, which I can't remember exactly. Oh, it's the sipunculars and the Ichnurias, those worms. Why were they ever thought to be separate from the annelids? Because I mean,
well, yeah, if you look in some of the 20-year-old seashore guides I've got, they're just given us being each in a separate phylum of their own, even though they sort of look like worms, but they don't sort of look segmented in the way that earthworms.
I was flashing. Is now.
So they now thought, as a result of these genetic analyses, to be actually within the annelids.
Yeah, because they're like a phylum on their own, weren't they?
Yeah.
Which is a bit odd.
Yeah, and although they're not found in the.
It was, wasn't it?
Yes. Jan, can you mute for a second?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought we were muted.
We can hear you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, carry on, Rob.
Yeah, one of the interesting things was that in the group called the Ecdysozoa, which includes all the crustaceans and the insects and a few other things, is that the nematode worms are in there. The nematodes. Is anyone familiar with those? A lot of them are like parasites of cattle, and farmers try to get rid of them. And things like lungworm in cows, and a lot of them are parasites of plants as well, and cause plant diseases in potatoes and things like that. And they, when I was at school, they were thought to be very closely related to earthworms, because they were worms, but they're now thought to be actually more closely related to insects and crustaceans, because they're within this new group called the Ecdysozoa.
Okay, Rob, I think we're going to need to come to an end.
Yep.
Well, what can I say? So much detail, and I've learned quite a lot tonight. I'm sure everybody else has as well.
I think
as I'm saying, you know, as taxonomy is
to put into
pretty complex.
one talk, yeah.
Well, it's a but it's a big subject. But I do love the way you kind of link a lot of stuff together tonight on the shore. I mean, I think what comes out of it, of course, as we all know, as enthusiasts, marine enthusiasts on the shore, is, you know, just how incredibly diverse and complex, you know, seashores are essentially. As of course,